Mr. Maraziti, would you come up first and maybe just give a recap on some of the things you've heard and answers to them?
Fix this
By
down
the way,
here.
Mr. Maraziti is the attorney representing the City of Hoboken in this matter.
There you go. Thank you. I wanted to just clarify the record on two matters, one having to do with the issue of relocation and the other having to do with environmental issues. There is an understandable misunderstanding about the obligation for relocation. It is understood by some incorrectly to mean that when a party is condemning property, they must find and pay for a new site for the property that is being acquired. That is not the law in New Jersey. The obligation is to assist in finding a location. The assistance requires the providing of consultants to help search. It doesn't require that the condemning entity pay for any other location or build it out. When there is a business to be relocated, there's a requirement to pay reasonable relocation moving costs. In this case, we followed the law the last time there was an ordinance to authorize acquisition by condemnation if necessary, and obtained a workable relocation assistance plan from a consultant. That was submitted under the law to the Department of Community Affairs, which responded that since there is not an operating entity on the site, there's nothing to be relocated. That is still the case today. So the issue about relocation is misunderstood, and I just wanted to clear that up. The other issue is about environmental costs, and that is not anything unique in this situation. Years back, the New Jersey Supreme Court grappled with the issue of how property that is contaminated should be appraised for whatever purpose, for tax purposes or for acquisition purposes. And in a decision that is understood to be the Saddam decision, the court concluded that they could have gone a couple of different ways, but they said the law is when you're doing an appraisal of this sort, you make the assumption that the property is not contaminated or not so contaminated as to affect the market value. So the parlance in the industry is that this is an appraisal as if the property is clean. The court set up a process whereby there can be an evaluation, which has not yet been done, at least by the city, of what remediation may be necessary. And from the value of the property, the city can set aside in court the estimated amount it would cost to remediate the property. We don't know what that cost is. We haven't gotten on the site to do any of that. Then there's a process where the property owner can allege that we have overestimated the cost, and we have a debate about what the actual cost of remediation needs to be. It's been said that it's not fair because New York Waterway did not contaminate the site. This is not a question about that. It's a question about what's the market value of the property. When you're buying, if you're a private property owner selling property that's contaminated, the fact that the property is contaminated reduces the value of the property. That's the concept that is expressed in paragraph 7, 8, and 9 of the ordinance. I just wanted to clarify those two issues because there's significant misunderstanding.
Could you, Mr. Maraziti, just for
Yes.
numbers' sake, it's determined that the property's worth $10 million. All these numbers are meaningless. It's determined that the property's worth $10 million, but the contamination to clean up is 50.
Yeah.
Now tell me what happens.
Then if that were to happen, you're giving the example where the cleanup is more expensive than the value of the property, then the new owner, namely in this case the city, would have to consider what they were going to do about remediating the site to bring it into standards. Of course, that is an exaggerated, deliberately exaggerated case,
right.
but that's the factor.
So at that
there.
point, if that were the
There-
case,
there-
who's making up,
Then-
who's paying for the
Yeah,
cleanup?
then I just want to go on to say, the city could seek to identify the parties responsible for that contamination and obtain judgments against them through a litigation process.
So it would go back to Union Dry Dock possibly?
It could possibly go back to, here's the issue. Did New York Waterway, what kind of a transaction did New York Waterway have with Union Dry Dock? Did they accept the environmental responsibility, which is often done in a transaction? In which case, Union Dry Dock is not responsible to New York Waterway. The issue would be then, is New York Waterway responsible for that overage? I have no information, I want to stress this, about the environmental condition of that site. We have not received any information about that. The only information I have was in a meeting when Mayor Zimmer was attempting to negotiate the purchase before New York Waterway purchased it. We were told by representatives of Union Dry Dock that the site was not very contaminated. There was an acknowledgement of contamination in the silt to some extent, but it was a verbal statement, so I have no information about it.
Thank you. Do any other...
Council President?
Yes,
I do have a
Councilman.
question, a follow-up to that. So we've done this before. We've used eminent domain on some of the properties here in the southwest part of town, and I do recall in the early part of the process that we had the right to go in and
Yes.
do an environmental study. And I mean, if the environmental study turns out that this is not something that we want to take on, then we can just back out
That's
of
right.
the whole process.
You can do that.
Yeah, so,
Yes,
you know.
You can, this is authorizing the initiation of the process, and as the mayor pointed out, the first step is a conversation, an attempt to negotiate, to show our appraisal to them, to hear rebuttals about what we overlooked, if anything, maybe we did, and to work all that through, and in that process, there can be voluntary site access given for the purpose of doing exactly what you mentioned. And in the absence of voluntary access, there is a process for involuntary access. We haven't taken that step.
Council President?
Yes, Councilwoman.
And just in this process, right now, we are capped at the 11.3 million, right? Like that's the amount that the mayor
Right.
has the ability to offer up to. So if it's $1 over, it comes back to the council.
It does.
So in the negotiations,
Yes.
gives them a good starting point, but it
Yes.
may have to come back.
It would have to come back to the council if there was a different number. That's right.
Whatever, 13.1? Sorry, I did use the wrong number.
I-
What's the number?
It's 13 million.
Right.
It's
Sorry.
105,000.
I transposed. Transposed.
Does any other council members have questions for Mr.
Council-
Maraziti?
Council President?
Yes.
Joe, so this gets taken to court, obviously, to determine the true fair market value.
Yes.
We're not responsible for relocation,
That's right.
okay? Is it within the judge's purview to potentially say that there might be a financial cost to the city to help in the relocation of the facility? In other words, could they argue that they are currently parking their ferries at the site, even though they're not fueling, so we don't need to find them a fueling facility, but we need to find them a place to park their ferries?
That wouldn't be part of what the judge would do. That would be part of the relocation, the workable relocation assistance plan.
Sure.
The so-called RAP. And if it's necessary to move some ferries that are parked there,
Yeah.
that's an easy thing to
So if
do.
I'm their lawyer, I'm talking to you, Joe Maraziti, Your Honor, I disagree with Joe. We're currently docking our ferries there,
Yeah.
and and it is state law to help with the relocation of that, and that's a potential argument they could make.
But the argument would be to assist in moving the ferries, not to find and pay for a new site for the ferries. That's the point I made.
So physically moving the ferries, like getting
That's right.
a tugboat to
That's right.
take them off the property.
That's right.
But then but we take them off the property, and they'll say we don't have any place to put them.
That's
Where
right.
does that leave us?
And the point I'm trying to make is
Yeah.
that the New Jersey statute on relocation obligations does not require the condemning party to find or pay for a new site.
Right.
It requires the services of consultants, real estate consultants, to search the market, identify particular areas, but not to pay. That's the statute on the books.
Yeah, just following their, their roadmap on this one, they're going to drag their feet. It's going to continue to become a legal argument that's going to last far beyond, I think, anyone in this room cares to say out loud. The other portion of this was remediation. My knowledge is that nobody owned the space before Union Dry Dock. That's been there for better part of a century, correct? Oh, what was there before, Mary?
No, don't, I'm sorry. Cut.
Okay.
Direct.
Well, I'm just curious because if there is a defunct operator on that site that was there prior to Union Dry Dock, and that entity no longer exists in business practice or perhaps even in life, who then pays for the remediation?
Well, they would, obviously, if they'd gone bankrupt, and this is something that happens with contaminated sites. They become orphan sites, as Councilman Doyle knows well. And that would be, in answer to the Council President's question, that would be an issue we would have to deal with. It goes back to what Councilman Cunningham said. We need to get our hands around what's there and what we have to do with it. It's also possible that what's there can be remediated in place or capped. There's a whole other conversation for the whole other.
Yeah, it's a conversation we're not sure of how deep
That's right.
that it goes.
We don't have information about that at all.
All right, thank you, Joe.
Mr. Maraziti, just one last question. I mean, we've heard from a number of people about how this, the process will be dragged out for a long time. Is it not the case that if it's needed and we have to exercise the eminent domain authority,
Yes.
we get the property, and then the fight is over the payment, but the lawsuit will not go on for years and years over whether we get the property?
Well, I expect there will be a challenge along the lines of what we heard from some of the opponents to the ordinance saying tonight. They've been laying out a preliminary legal argument that I've been paying attention to, because I suspect that's the New York Waterway argument, which is that it's not a public purpose, and if it is a public purpose, it's not necessary. So that is going to be an issue that may come up early in the proceedings when we get past that issue. And when the judge appoints condemnation commissioners and decides that it is a public purpose and we do have a necessity to acquire it, then the next step is there are 3 commissioners appointed, not a court yet. We're not in a courtroom yet. And at that point, and some would say even earlier, we could deposit assuming we failed to negotiate voluntarily, we could deposit into court the $13,105,000. And at that moment, title would pass to the city. This is what you're talking about. Then the court procedures allow the property owner to withdraw that money from court, leaving behind that amount that I talked about, that is the disputed amount for environmental remediation. They have that amount of money that's left. We fight about the environmental remediation, and we fight about whether 13 million is the proper number or not. The commissioners will make a determination. If that commissioner's decision is appealed, it goes to court and it goes to a jury trial.
But all this time, we have
All
the
this
property.
time, if we deposit the money into court, we would have ownership and possession of the property. Once we get over that first step, yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm sorry, one
Yeah,
more.
one last question. Can you just talk a little bit about, the 900-pound gorilla, which is when I
I'm
said,
not
can you
hearing you
just
clearly.
can you just talk a little bit about the 900-pound gorilla, which is New Jersey Transit decides that they want to acquire it, and just what happens and what that means for us?
Yes, if the agency of the state that's charged with the responsibility for public transportation decides that they want this site and they acquire it from New York Waterway, as they had intended to do, there is an option agreement that expired. It has not been renewed. But if they do that, then that takes away the right of the city to acquire the property because we're subordinate to the core mission of New Jersey Transit. in that
And
situation.
does that happen in like parallel? So we go down our process, we're in the middle of it, and at any time, New Jersey Transit just shows up with their check and says we're buying it, it kind of just stops our process?
Well, of course, it depends on when that happens. If
Right.
it happened tonight, it would stop things right
Right.
now. If it happened after my little colloquy with Councilman Doyle, we have deposited the money in court and we own it, then they have to pay us for it,
Right.
right? We'll be on the other end of that seizing of property. We would be the CZ in that situation, and everything I've been saying would be flipped, and New Jersey Transit would have to deal with us on all of that. We would be subject to all the procedures on the other side of the table.
Okay.
I should say that it's been a long time since New Jersey Transit allowed that option to expire, and I was there with many of you urging New Jersey Transit not to do that on Martin Luther King Day. Governor Murphy publicly spoke out about the folly of spending that kind of money on that project, and nothing has happened in all this period of time, and New Jersey Transit currently does not have a quorum.
Oh, really?
Either. That's right. So there are all these things in
They don't
mix.
have a quorum? That's interesting that they don't have a quorum.
That's right.
Interesting.
3 voting members.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Does anyone here want to get appointed really quick? Thank you, Mr. Maraziti.